Thank you. I want to say before we get started, I was particularly, I thought it was particularly appropriate that I believe the title of the last poem you read last night was Illumination.
Right.
It was wonderful. I'm wondering if we could begin perhaps by having you tell us a little bit about how Beyond Katrina came about, and if I can give a little more direction. I was thinking about this book this morning. It seems as though a lot of the things that you're concerned about in Beyond Katrina, you'd already been dealing with them in Native Guard. The sense of kind of layering a personal life with these historical events and meanings, and a concern with uncovering the true stories that had been kind of pushed to the side by systems of power. And I'm just curious what it was like to realize after Katrina that there was a need for that in a very immediate kind of situation that also was a very personal kind of situation for you.
You know, I never intended to write Beyond Katrina. And the way that it came about was, I think, at this point, a fortunate accident. I mentioned last night when I read a poem called Theories of Time and Space, which is the first poem in Native Guard. It's also the first poem in Beyond Katrina that makes use of a few poems scattered here and there. What I said was that I wrote that poem. It's the very first poem that I wrote for Native Guard, and it's a poem that is very figurative when I wrote it. It was considering the impossibility of returning home to these places that we grow up and leave behind, and the impossibility, not because the places are gone or forever changed, but that because when we go away, we change. And so, of course, that's part of what nostalgia means, having a memory or a love of something, and of course it was never quite as we imagine it to have been. And so I turned in the book in March with that poem, the very figurative poem about not being able to go home. And by August of 2005, the poem had become literal, and I couldn't read it the same way anymore because it meant very differently than it had meant when I first wrote it. And it really was indeed about the inability to go back to the place that I left, because that place was destroyed and forever changed. Now, the way that I got involved in writing Beyond Katrina is because of an editor of a literary journal, Ted Genoways, who's the editor of VQR, asked me in August, I guess August of '07, if I would come and give the Page Barber Lectures at the University of Virginia, filling in for another writer who had been asked a year in advance to do it, who had to back out at the last minute because of health reasons. He asked me to give this series of lectures, and it's three-hour lectures, and it was going to take place in November, so there wasn't a lot of time for me to get them done. But Ted's a great editor, and he said, I'd like you to do this, and I know exactly what you should do. I want you to write about the Mississippi Gulf Coast now in the wake of Katrina. I want you to go down there. I think you should structure it, the essays like this, present, past, and future, and just do it like you write your poems. And I thought, oh, okay. Because when I finished Native Guard, I thought I was done with the Mississippi Gulf Coast. I thought, you know, been there, done that as a writer. And so I had not intended to go back. But when the storm hit and the aftermath that we saw again and again on television took the turn that it did, I began to feel that my silence would be a bad thing, that I needed actually to go and to say something about this place that I loved and the people there. And so I went down there with one book in my pocket that meant the world to me, which was Robert Penn Warren's Segregation, a book he published I think in 1956. It was first serialized in Life magazine, and this is the book in which Robert Penn Warren, it's sort of a travel narrative, part travel narrative in a way. He goes back to the South to rethink his feelings about the South and its history in the wake of Brown versus the Board of Education and desegregation. I know this is getting to be a long answer. I'm going to stop it in a moment. So I took that book. What I loved about the book also is that it's part interviews, part travel narrative, and the way that it ends, you just see this part that's a Q and an A, and it keeps going back with the question and the answer. And the last answer is, of course, this is an interview with myself. So the book was really all about Robert Penn Warren and his journey back. And that sort of gave me a way to think about not only the larger history of the place, but my personal connection to it. Those were the first 3 essays. And I was supposed to just expand what was there in the first half of the book for the rest of it. And then our lives took a dramatic turn when my brother, out of desperation, did something that landed him in prison. And so the book changed, and he became, his story became emblematic of the kinds of struggles that people were still facing in the wake of the hurricane.
You know, I read, when I finished reading Beyond Katrina, I flipped the page and saw the acknowledgments at the end, which normally I don't read acknowledgments, but for some reason I did. And one of the things that struck me about that was that the last person you thank is Joe, and you say that this was always his story, or his was always the story.
That's right.
And I found myself wondering, I loved Beyond Katrina, and I like the kind of, for lack of a better word, the multimedia experience of getting essays, poetry, photographs, and yet it is not in any way a linear narrative. And I wonder if you could share with us why tell Joe's story, and through Joe the Gulf Coast story, in that more circular fashion, and why the interest in the photographs and bringing all of those pieces together?
Well, the other book that I loved, that I think of as a model for my own thinking about how to shape Beyond Katrina, was Nicholas Lehman's The Promised Land, which was about the early 20th century African American migration from the South to northern cities, particularly Chicago. And what I loved about that book is that even as he is writing about history and political economy of the sharecropping industry, and then when they brought in the cotton, the machine that could pick cotton and didn't meant that we didn't need as many laborers picking cotton. He's looking at the Johnson administration, all sorts of stuff around this. But what I loved most was that he's focusing on this one family, the family of a woman named Ruby Daniels. And so he traces their lives and looks at the history and political economy through the lens of this one family and what they experience in their move from Mississippi up to Chicago, ending up ultimately in the Robert Taylor homes, which were one of the first housing projects built in Chicago. So I like that methodology. And when I first started writing the book, I had this idea that what I would do was to write about some of the people who had been the tenants in these houses that my family had owned for a long time, and that Joe had taken over and was doing all the work on. We had some tenants, one woman named Miss Mary, who had been a tenant in one of our houses for nearly 30 years. And so she was very close to us in that way. And her story was pretty dramatic also after the hurricane. And so that was my initial thought. And then I couldn't find Miss Mary anymore. First of all, once her house started falling apart and Joe couldn't repair it anymore, she had to go somewhere else. And so I couldn't find her. And that's when it occurred to me that even before what happened to my brother happened, that his telling this sort of through him as a descendant of my great uncle's son, the person who was trying to work on these houses and to make his own life in this business, and what he lost was a good way of just dealing with a particular individual who was, again, emblematic and suffering the kinds of things that people on the coast were going through. The reason that I don't tell it in a straight linear narrative, I think, has more to do with the way I write poems. I'm always interested, because I am such a narrative person, because I am very linear. I think that I have to find ways to undercut what I think of as my pedestrian, linear tendencies. And so I do it by circling back always to certain themes, so that the book moves forward in a linear fashion, but it does so by circling back to something again and again. And I also felt that by the time I finished it, I could have put it in that linear order such that you would see my brother's sentencing before you'd see his letters from prison. And yet there was something, I thought, emblematic about the moment of his sentencing, and the idea that how far to go the Mississippi Gulf Coast has in terms of recovery and rebuilding. Because the book ends with this scene of, before the poem that shows that he's getting out of prison, the book ends with this scene of a woman and her son who have been traveling for a long way, looking for a little respite, looking for the sanctuary that public libraries often provide, because there's a computer, there's a nice bathroom, there's air conditioning, and they pull up next to us when we're standing outside the courthouse after my brother has just been taken away, and ask where the public library is. And I raise my hand to point to it before I catch myself and realize that it's not there anymore and has not yet been rebuilt, and I don't think that there are plans actually to rebuild that public library.
That was one of the most moving moments in the book for me, especially when the thought that you record is going through your head was, you can't get there from here, which is an echo, but a change of that first line of theories of time and space. And I experienced that as a moment of really profound ambivalence. Of, on the one hand, there is this loss, and it seems like there's been an awareness that if the book begins with this idea that we can go back to the places, but we ourselves have changed, so the places are not quite the same, now there's a realization that, wait a minute, the places can disappear too. And yet there's also the final image of Beyond Katrina, which also in its own way is an ambivalent image of Joe leaving the courtroom. And you say that it's as if he were pointing to a destination someplace not far up the road.
Yeah, he did that same thing that I did, like that when he was walking out. He didn't look at us, he just did this. And that's exactly what I did when I was trying to show them where they should go that wasn't there.
And that suggestion of a destination, on the one hand, we know what the destination is, but it's also suggestive of the idea that we're still on a journey, we're still going somewhere.
Well, and the actual final image of the whole book is the poem Benediction, which is also ambivalent, because he's getting out of prison, which is great, but he basically has nothing, except what he can carry in one hand.
Has the writer of Beyond Katrina, let me rephrase that, what has the writer of Beyond Katrina learned at that point? Do you feel like there's any resolution to these questions about time and space, or is it continuing to be an ongoing meditation?
I think it is an ongoing meditation. Yeah. I think you said it right when you mentioned that kind of ambivalence. I don't think that I am. What's the right word? I don't think I'm sort of wallowing in some kind of sadness or negativity about it. But I think that I am very realistic about the ongoing struggle, the ongoing journey, the ongoing challenges. It's kind of like why I love the end of Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. That's what it's like.
You know, as you say that, the one thing that I'm thinking about is the voice in not only Beyond Katrina in the narrative part, but in the poetry. I'm wondering if this might be an appropriate time to ask you to read one of the poems where the voice came through very clearly to me, and that is Liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
And that raises a couple of questions, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about. But I've marked it here in the book for you.
It's a good thing it's daylight, because if the lights go off in here today, I haven't memorized this one. So this is Liturgy for the Mississippi Gulf Coast. To the security guard staring at the Gulf, thinking of bodies washed away from the coast, plugging her ears against the bells and sirens, sound of alarm, the gaming floor on the coast. To Billy Scarpetta, waiting tables on the coast, staring at the Gulf, thinking of water rising, thinking of New Orleans, thinking of cleansing the coast. To the woman dreaming of returning to the coast, thinking of water rising, her daughter's grave, my mother's grave, underwater on the coast. To Miss Mary, somewhere. To the displaced living in trailers along the coast, beside the highway, in vacant lots and open fields. To everyone who stayed on the coast, who came back or cannot to the coast. To those who died on the coast. This is a memory of the coast, to each his own recollections, her reclamations, their restorations, the return of the coast. This is a time capsule for the coast, words of the people, don't forget us, the sound of wind, waves, the silence of graves. The muffled voice of history, bulldozed and buried under sand, poured on the eroding coast, the concrete slabs of rebuilding the coast. This is a love letter to the Gulf Coast, a praise song, a dirge, invocation and benediction, a requiem for the Gulf Coast. This cannot rebuild the coast. It is an indictment, a complaint, my logos, argument and discourse with the coast. This is my nostos, my pilgrimage to the coast, my memory, my reckoning, native daughter, I am the Gulf Coast.
Thank you. When I hear that, I hear just a hint of a voice that you introduce in Native Guard. At the beginning of the second section, you uses the epigraph, everybody knows about Mississippi, from Nina Simone's song, Mississippi Goddamn.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself wondering if you feel something like what she must have felt, which is the anger. I mean, that's what comes through to me in that song, is anger and frustration. And yet it's an anger and frustration that is born out of love, of caring deeply about Mississippi.
Right.
How do you see your own relationship to Mississippi, to the Gulf Coast area?
Well, I mean, I think it is very much like, as you say, Nina Simone's attitude toward the coast, one that is to the south. It's based on that love-hate relationship. It's also reflected in the epigraph that I take from Whitman at the beginning of the third section, O Magnet South, that ends with good and evil, oh, all dear to me. And so I think, the most, I think, sophisticated and reasonable relationship that any of us can have to our home places, our native states, our nation, is one of love and hate. I mean, if you don't have anything to complain about the place you come from, you're probably not looking very closely at it. My reasons for hating and loving, of course, let me just talk about the reasons for hating. Those are the ones that are probably obvious if you look at me. Why Mississippi, I might have that feeling in Mississippi, goddamn, for a state that rendered me illegal, illegitimate, the perpetual sort of Jim Crow, even, now what's happening in the state. and you know, a nation that rendered people like me illegal and illegitimate. So there's plenty of reasons to complain about the history of a place, but you know, it's the only home I have. Thus, I love it too. And in loving it, I have to criticize it so it can be better.
That poem, if you'll pardon me for pursuing a question that is of very personal interest to me, a lot of the work that I do deals with religion and literature. In Beyond Katrina, you say that you are not a religious woman, and yet it seems as though, just like Jim Crow and all of these other parts of the South have become a part of you, so too has the religion. Even skimming through the table of contents of Beyond Katrina, it's pilgrim, providence, liturgy, benediction.
There was even an exegesis in there, but that's the one poem that didn't make it in. Yeah.
Oh, I'm disappointed.
Well, it was in the magazine when I published the poems, but because of the place that the poems appear in the book, it would have said too early something that needed to be revealed later on, so it had to go out.
Would have explained it too well. Can you say a little bit about the importance of this not being a religious woman, but also the importance of religion to the culture in which you live and about which you're writing, and just that tension?
Well, I mean, I think it's two things. I think quite literally, having grown up across the street from a church that my great aunt Sugar founded in an arbor, you know, back in the early part of the 20th century, and spending so many Sundays there with my grandmother, and you know, I couldn't help sort of hearing and taking in all the cadences of, you know, the hymns, the sermon, the call and response, all of that. But I think the other side is just language. I think I mentioned in the book that when I was working on the poem Liturgy, I was surprised to look at the word and to discover that in the original Greek, it just meant one's public duty or a duty to the state. So many of these, the words of religious ceremony have those those sort of, well, secular origins, these meanings. And so I feel like I approach them in both ways. I mean, one is from the secular love of words and their etymology, and also my own experience growing up in the church.
I want to come back with that idea in mind to the final poem of Beyond Katrina, the benediction. A benediction is both an ending and a beginning. It's an ending of a service, but it is a blessing and a statement of hope to those who exit the church and go back out into the world. Clearly it is a benediction for Joe, but it's also a benediction for people who have read the book and have journeyed to the end. What is your hope for the Gulf Coast from this point forward? What are and I think along with that, I think one question that probably anyone who reads this book is going to have is, where's Joe now? How's he doing? Have those hopes been realized?
My hopes for the Gulf Coast are very practical. You know, not too long ago, and this is one of the things that I mentioned in the book too, a lot of the federal funds that were supposed to be used to help the poorest citizens recover and rebuild their lives were diverted to other projects, larger business projects that had already been in the works prior to the hurricane. So, for example, the port at Gulfport. And so, yeah, the state government in Mississippi found ways to deprive those citizens who needed it most of a way to rebuild their lives. Because of that, a lot of people are struggling. A lot of low-income housing, including the kinds of properties that we owned, have not been rebuilt. There's a lot of blight. People have nowhere affordable to live because they're not rebuilding low-income housing in the same numbers that were there before the storm. So my very practical hope for the Mississippi Gulf Coast is that we make it a place that people who have lived and worked there their whole lives can continue to live productive lives and have decent places to live. You know, beyond that, I also hope for things like a way to sort of maintain something of the rich culture of the coast, such that we won't see that being erased and sort of buried underneath all of the corporate interests, the casinos, everything that sort of creates a Disney America, where, you know, the rich cultural heritage of an individual place, its individual feel and flavor and all that is paved over by something that is only a simulacra of what might have been there before. For Joe, the journey is ongoing, but he is in his first semester at Jefferson Davis Community College.
Wonderful.
I'm really happy.
Good. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and I know some writers are reluctant to talk about the next projects, but would you be willing to tell us a little bit about the next project and how you see yourself continuing on a journey? What lies in store?
Well, I have a new book coming out, so that one feels, and I hope it is, finished now. I just had to turn it into my publisher last week. It's a book called Thrall, and I got the idea for the title when I was finishing up Native Guard. I was looking in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, because I always look up words that I think I already know the definition to, because of course when you look up words, what you realize is that in those secondary and tertiary and on definitions is the possibility of deepening the figurative levels of your poems and how you're using the language of a poem. And when I did that, I was surprised to learn that what I'd expected to be the first definition that came up for native, someone who's a native of Mississippi or a plant native to North Carolina, was not what came up. Instead, it was someone born into the condition of servitude, a thrall, which was just fascinating to me, because of course it linked us to the history of colonialism and imperialism. When we go there to colonize those people, they are the natives. And so I had spent so much time thinking about the word native for Native Guard, because it, my name shares the prefix, as do words like nativity or national, or so I was very interested in this word, and to think that so that my name is also connected to this idea of thrall. And I was, to make this pun that I have to make, literally enthralled by the idea that that word meant someone born to the condition of servitude or bondage. But with the word thrall, we also get enthrall, the way that we are enthralled to beauty, enthralled by beauty, or the way we are enthrall, I-N space T-H-R-A-L-L, to language, particularly language that seeks to name us. And so, having grown up black and biracial in the Deep South, and in a time when it was still illegal, and then ongoing into a time that at least culturally it was still frowned upon, and various taxonomies were applied to name what it meant to be biracial, that became a starting point for me, because I'm still interested in the way language helps to shape experience. And so the starting point of the book really is a sequence of poems called Taxonomy, which is about Mexican Costa paintings. And the Costa paintings in colonial Mexico represented the mixed blood unions that were taking place in the colony. And they were fascinating because, you would see they were done in series of 16. They always began with the white Spaniard father, and showed all the different mixtures that you would get if you mixed with, the blood of indigenous people, the blood of, Africans who'd been brought to the colony. And they had these taxonomies right there on the paintings. And so I was, taken by the fact that they would show these families and the offspring as if, this is definitely what you got. Like if you mix paint colors, you're always going to get this person here. And then, taxonomies like, de español y de India produce mestizo. And, what you get to make mulatto. I was also taken with the idea across time and space, an idea I think very much rooted in religion, of ideas of blood and purity of blood. And one of the beliefs in colonial Mexico was that indigenous blood was an essentially pure blood, and so after a few generations of intermixing with the indigenous people, you would then produce white offspring, but that the taint of African blood was irreversible. So you got names like mulatto returning backwards, hold yourself in midair, and I don't understand you. That's where it begins. I was just interested in those paintings and the language that went along with them. And Mark Doty, the poet, has said our metaphors go on ahead of us. And so what I wasn't thinking of at the time, but I'm glad that our metaphors know more than we do and that we just have to catch up, is that this was a way to investigate my relationship with my white father, and what that has meant both for us and the country that we still inhabit. And so this sort of enlightenment moment in history in colonial Mexico is a way to illuminate my own experience with my father.
It sounds exciting, and I'm looking forward to getting a copy of it when it's published. I could sit here and ask you questions all day. I've got all kinds of things that I'm interested in, but we're getting to a point in the hour where I think it would probably be best to turn outwards to the audience and see if any of you all have questions to ask, things that you're interested in, would like to know more about.
I do. I'm curious, you see kind of in like, there's like an informal maxim in like documentary films and kind of other places that's like, if you're not angry, you're not listening. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of similar to something that you said, and I'm just wondering how whether or not that gives you anxiety and how you've like separated your voice from that type kind of.
Oh, I think it gives me purpose. I often say that, the poet Phil Levine says, I write what is given me to write. And I've been given a very troubled history, both personal and collective, with other Americans and people around the world. But also a terrible beauty. And so I think if it weren't for Mississippi, I don't know what I would be doing. Mississippi, sort of like the way W.H. Auden said of Yeats, Mad Ireland, hurt you into poetry. This country, my home state, has hurt me into poetry, but it's a beautiful hurt. It's it's the burden of history that I am more than happy to take up, and yeah, it gives me a sense of purpose. Yes.
Well, I don't imagine you're trained in meteorology. I don't want to ask you scientific questions, but as you read Liturgy, I was struck with the repetition of the word coast. Mm-hmm. There are many coasts, and they say, I'm not a scientist either, but people suggest that the coasts of this planet are under threat in the future. Mm-hmm. I just wondered, as you looked at what happened to the Gulf Coast, you thought about this happening in other places in the future, if that's something that crossed your mind.
Well, I did have to think a lot about environmental issues when I was working on Beyond Katrina. I'd always been fascinated by the Gulf Coast, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, the stretch that I'm from, because it is sort of the longest man-made beach in the world, like 26 miles. It was originally a natural kind of mangrove swamp that they bulldozed and then dumped all this sand that they got from somewhere so that it would kind of look like Florida, and it could sort of encourage the tourism. And so that is one of the things, of course, that left the Mississippi Gulf Coast particularly vulnerable to the storm surge, and really why, when that Category 5 hurricane came in, there was less protection, and less of the natural protection that the mangrove swamp would have provided. There's constant issues of erosion going on there, and literally, it's a way of thinking about what's going to disappear. And I think about it in that literal way, but I also think about it in a figurative way. Even before I started having to read that stuff about, the scientific stuff about the environment and the effect of development, different kinds of development on the coast, I was always very aware of the metaphor of it and the idea of historical erasure. I thought of that as a kind of historical erasure, that we had come in and sort of wiped out the natural environment, what had been there, and paved over it or put sand over it. And yet, for those of us willing to look deeper, we can actually find out what's hidden beneath these artificial man-made surfaces that we've created. And so it's always been a metaphor for me about how to uncover what has been lost, eroded, or erased in history.
I think I saw a hand go up just in front of Dr. Schramm.
Actually, you anticipated my question. I was going to ask you to talk about gates.
Oh.
I was imagining things, and you already answered. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak a little more possibly about, besides gates, what other echoes I might not have been imagining, other poets?
Oh, well, particularly for Native Guard, both Seamus Heaney and Evan Boland. In a Time of Violence is one of my favorite books. I love Boland's relationship to history, to her Ireland, her sense of psychological as well as physical exile at this point, but really more of a psychological exile toward her homeland. And Heaney, the last poem in Native Guard is a poem called South, which owes everything to his collection, North, and the title poem, North. It was in reading that poem that I began to see a way to have a kind of relationship with my South that could encompass dealing with its history and my personal relationship to it, and the feeling of being called to speak about it, to answer some of those questions about it.
Probably have time for maybe one more question if there's.
I have another question. I don't want to have the show though. Now that you are anthologized in advanced placement textbooks and things like that.
I didn't know that.
Yes, you are. You're in the Perrines edition for advanced placement.
Do you know what poem it is?
Yes, I do.
Because I'm wondering if this is why I get a lot of questions. People
know
write to me.
about a history teacher perpetuating the lie.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Can you tell me what this poem means, please?
Yeah, I do
that
get
kind of
those
question?
questions.
No, it asks if we can determine from the text if the speaker, if the teacher is white or black.
Oh, that's the question?
First question.
And yeah.
But my question was, what would you like English teachers to do with your poems now? What would you love us to do with your poems? What would you love us not to do with them?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I've got to quote Billy Collins just to begin this answer, but when he's in the poem and he's talking about, so often students want to strap a poem to a chair and beat a confession out of it. I really believe that with my poems in particular, but this is the way that I read poems myself and I read poems with my students, I mean, I want that first, the reading that is the reading for pleasure, for, for the sounds, for the imagery. I want a reading that is for the literal meaning of the words and the sentences. Then I want that reading for the figurative possibilities of the words and the sentences. I mean, there's each of these layers. Poetry is the one way we have of saying what we mean and meaning something else at the same time. And so I do want people to just understand the literal level first and then go off somewhere from there. I think sometimes if we do it in the reverse, we're only thinking that everything symbolizes something as opposed to being exactly what it is. So if we start with exactly what it is, I mean, the poem is saying exactly what it's saying. No, it's saying something else too. And I hope that, on successive readings, someone will come to that as well. But I'm completely happy for someone to understand exactly what I'm saying.
Well, thank you very much for your time today. I've enjoyed talking to you. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening, and I think a round of applause from Ms. Trethewey would be in order.